The mud was a cold, greedy thing, sucking at the hem of her dress, its chill seeping through the worn soles of her shoes. Alara stood on the crude planks of the auction block, a spectacle of shame beneath a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Rain, thin and merciless, slicked her hair to her scalp and traced icy paths down her cheeks, mingling with tears she refused to let fall. Around her, the town of absolution festered. Faces swam in a blur of contempt. Leering men, women whose pinched expressions held a cruel satisfaction. Their judgment was a physical weight, pressing down on her, heavier than the bulk of her own body, which they so openly despised. Her father's death had been the first stone in the avalanche that had buried her life. The debts, a pack of silent wolves, had devoured their small homestead, leaving nothing but bone and memory. Now she was the final asset to be liquidated. Alara Flint, 20 years of age, sold for indenture. The auctioneer, a man named Preacher Hobbs, whose piety was as thin as his lips, circled her like a vulture. "Sturdy?" he announced, his voice slick with false enthusiasm as he slapped her shoulder. The impact jarred her, a casual desecration. "Strong back for hauling and well-fed, as you can see. Won't be wasting away from a missed meal." A wave of coarse laughter rolled through the crowd. Alara's gaze dropped to the splintered wood beneath her feet. She focused on a dark knot in the grain, a tiny, imperfect world to fall into, a place where the jeers and the rain could not reach. Her flesh, the body that had carried her through famine and grief, was now her primary crime. Its softness, its breadth, was presented as a mark of indolence, a sign of some deep moral failing. They did not see the muscle beneath, born of years of tilling stubborn soil and hauling water from a near-dry creek. They saw only what they wished to scorn. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" Hobbs boomed. Silence answered him, thick and heavy. The townsfolk were here for the sport of it, the simple pleasure of watching a proud family brought low. A few men exchanged smirks, nudging each other. The bidding, when it began, was an exercise in humiliation. $1, someone called out, the voice thick with mockery. "2," another shouted, followed by a peal of laughter. Each bid was a fresh lash. $3. "4." The numbers were so paltry they were meaningless as currency. Their only value was in the depth of the insult they carried. Alara felt a tremor start in her hands and fought to still it, balling them into fists until her knuckles were white stones. She would not give them the satisfaction of her collapse. She would stand. She would endure. Her father had taught her that. "Endurance is a quiet form of rebellion," he used to say. The bidding stalled at $5, offered by a saloon owner with eyes like dirty glass. He looked her over, a slow, appraising glance that stripped her bare. A chilling understanding bloomed in her chest. Indenture was a clean word for what he intended. $5 going once?" Hobbs called, his impatience showing. The rain was dampening the crowd's enthusiasm. Then, a new voice, slurred with drink, cut through the air. "I'll give you 6. $1 for every stone she carries over a proper woman." The crowd roared. It was the final, perfect cruelty. $6. The sum of her existence. The price of her shame. Hobbs grinned, raising his gavel. $6 it is, from Mr. Abernathy. A bargain for such ample service. Alara closed her eyes. This was it. The end of one misery, the beginning of another, infinitely worse. The sound of the gavel rising, the sharp intake of breath from the crowd, the smell of wet earth and despair. It all fused into a single moment of terrifying clarity. But the gavel did not fall. A silence different from before descended. It was not a mocking silence, but one of sharp, sudden tension. Alara opened her eyes. The crowd had parted. Standing in the space they had made was a man who seemed carved from the mountain itself. He was tall and broad, wrapped in buckskin and silence, his dark hair long and damp from the rain. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, a thick beard obscuring his mouth, but his eyes were fixed on her. They were not filled with pity or lust or contempt. They held a stillness, a deep and unnerving quiet. She had seen him before, a phantom at the edge of town, trading pelts for flour and salt, never speaking a word. The townsfolk called him the Ridge Runner, the Mountain Man. A savage, they whispered. He took a slow step forward, his worn boots making no sound in the mud. He ignored Hobbs, ignored the gaping faces of the crowd. His focus was solely on her, an unbroken line of regard that felt less like an appraisal and more like a question. Then he moved his gaze to the auctioneer. A small, heavy leather pouch appeared in his hand. He tossed it onto the block. It landed with a solid, definitive clink of coin that cut through the air. It was far, far more than $6. His voice, when it came, was like the grinding of rock, deep and rough from disuse. It was not a shout, not a boom, but it thundered across the square, vibrating in Alara's very bones with an authority that was absolute. "You're coming with me." It was not a bid. It was a verdict. The gavel remained frozen in Preacher Hobbs's hand, the world holding its breath as the silent man waited. He did not ask for a response. He simply extended a large, calloused hand toward her. After a heart-stopping second of paralysis, Alara took it. His grip was firm, warm, and real. It was the first human touch she had felt in months that was not cruel or dismissive. As he led her down from the platform, the crowd melted away from their path, their derision replaced by a wary, fearful respect. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on the broad, buckskin-clad back in front of her, a shield between her and the world that had tried to break her, and walked away from the ruin of her life, toward an unknown and silent future. The journey was a silent pilgrimage away from the world of men. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long acquaintance with the unforgiving terrain, his stride long but measured. He never once looked back to see if she was following, yet he seemed to know her limits instinctively. When her breath grew ragged on a steep incline, his pace would subtly slow. When she stumbled on a loose scree of rock, his hand would appear, steadying her elbow, then retreat just as quickly. No words were exchanged. The forest and the rising wind were their only conversation. Alara's mind, which had been a storm of fear and humiliation, slowly settled into a state of wary observation. Who was this man? His name was a mystery, his motives a terrifying blank slate. In town, they saw him as a beast, a man who had turned his back on civilization. But here, in his element, he was something else entirely. He was a part of the landscape, his silence a kinship with the ancient trees, his watchfulness the same as the hawk circling high above. She studied his hands as he cleared a fallen branch from their path. They were scarred and capable, the nails clean. He carried a long rifle with the ease of a man carrying a third limb, and a heavy pack that seemed no burden at all. Her fear did not vanish, but it changed its shape. It was no longer the sharp, panicked terror of the auction block. It was a deeper, more primal anxiety, the fear of the unknown. Was he her savior or simply a different kind of captor? Had she traded a public cage for a private one? She watched him, searching for any sign of the brutishness the townsfolk attributed to him, but found none. There was only a profound and unsettling stillness about him, a self-containment so complete it felt like a fortress. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange through the canopy, they stopped. He shrugged off his pack, retrieving a waterskin and a piece of hard, dry bread. He broke the bread in half, offering her a piece. His eyes met hers for a brief moment. There was no command in them, only a quiet offering. Alara took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough as bark. She drank from the waterskin he offered, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. They ate in silence, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. The simple act of sharing food, of sitting beside another human being without the weight of expectation or judgment, felt strange and momentous. He built a fire with practiced ease, using a flint and steel to coax a flame from a small bundle of dry tinder he produced from his pack. The firelight pushed back the encroaching darkness, creating a small, warm bubble of safety in the vast wilderness. He laid out a thick bear pelt for her on one side of the fire, then took his place on the other, his back against a large oak, his rifle resting across his lap. He was not sleeping. He was watching the shadows, his posture relaxed but alert. A guardian. Alara lay down on the soft fur, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her. She was exhausted, her body aching from the climb, her spirit bruised and raw. Yet, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a strange sense of peace began to settle over her. Out here, the cruel laughter of the town was a faint echo. Her size, the source of so much shame, had been an asset on the trail, the strength in her legs carrying her onward when a more delicate woman might have faltered. Here, under the gaze of a silent stranger and a canopy of indifferent stars, her worth was not measured in dollars or derision. It was measured in each breath she took, in each step that carried her further away from absolution. She closed her eyes, not to the certainty of safety, but to the possibility of it, and listened to the steady crackle of the fire and the quiet presence of the man on the other side. They reached his home the following afternoon. It was not a cabin so much as a part of the mountain that had been given walls and a roof. Tucked into a granite shoulder overlooking a wide, forested valley, it was built of thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with moss and mud. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, meaning he had been here not long before his trip to town. The air was thin and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth, a scent so pure it felt like a cleansing. Inside, the space was small, a single room, but it was meticulously ordered. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers glowing faintly. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, built into the far wall, was covered with a thick patchwork of furs. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and tools, knives and axe woodworking implements, were arranged with care on pegs. There was a surprising lack of clutter, of grime. It was a place of solitude, not of squalor. He gestured toward the table, a silent invitation for her to sit, before moving to the hearth to stoke the fire. He worked with the same quiet efficiency she'd witnessed on the trail, adding wood, fetching water from a barrel by the door, his movements fluid and purposeful. Alara remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. The finality of her situation settled upon her. She was here in this isolated place, completely at his mercy. The fear she had managed to keep at bay returned, cold and sharp. He seemed to sense her unease. He stopped his work and turned to face her. For the first time, he truly looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. In the dim light of the cabin, she could see the lines etched around his eyes, the gray streaking his dark beard. He was older than she had first thought, a man weathered by seasons and solitude. He had seen things she could not imagine. He took a step toward her, and she flinched, a small, involuntary movement. He stopped immediately, holding up a hand, not to threaten, but to pacify. Then he spoke, his voice that same low rumble, but softer now, without the hard edge of command it had held in the town square. "You are safe here," he said. Just 4 words. He did not say his name. He did not explain why he had bought her. He simply stated a fact, as if it were as solid and reliable as the stone of the mountain. He then turned back to the fire, his posture indicating the conversation, such as it was over. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. He would rise before the sun, vanishing into the forest with his rifle, returning hours later with a rabbit or a brace of birds. He never asked her to do anything. The first few days, Alara existed in a state of suspended animation, too afraid to be useful, too proud to be idle. She watched him. She saw how he mended a tear in his buckskin shirt with a bone needle and sinew thread, his large hands surprisingly deft. She saw how he cleaned his rifle with painstaking care. She saw how he would sometimes stand at the cabin door at sunset, looking out over the valley with an expression of profound, unshakable loneliness. Slowly, tentatively, she began to claim a space for herself. She found a broom and swept the hearth. She took the pot of stew he left simmering and added wild onions she recognized from a patch near the cabin. She found his torn shirt and, using her own small sewing kit from her meager bundle of possessions, repaired it with neat, even stitches that were far superior to his own rough work. Each act was a silent question, and his acceptance was his silent answer. When he returned and found the floor swept or his stew improved, he would simply nod, a slight, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. When he put on the mended shirt, he ran his thumb over her stitching, his expression unreadable. In this quiet, non-judgmental world, something within Alara began to uncoil. The shame that had been her constant companion started to recede. Her body here was not an object of scorn but a tool for survival. Her strength allowed her to haul heavy buckets of water. Her stamina let her walk for miles to forage for berries and roots. She began to feel a sense of competence, of worth, that was entirely her own, forged in the silence of the mountains. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the windows and shaking the sturdy logs of the cabin, the men from Absolution came. She heard them before she saw them, their drunken shouts carried on the wind. Abernathy, the man who had bid $6, and two of his cronies. They had come for the prize they felt they were owed. A violent pounding echoed on the door. "Mountain Man, we know you're in there. We've come for the fat sow you stole from us." The man, Silas, she had finally learned his name from a carving on a powder horn, rose without a word. There was no fear in him, only a cold, hard stillness. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the heavy iron bar that secured it. He looked back at Alara, and his eyes held a clear, unspoken instruction. Stay back. But something had broken in her that night on the auction block, and something new had been forged in the weeks since. She was no longer the girl who would cower and wait. As Silas lifted the bar, she moved to the hearth, her hand closing around the heavy iron poker. His weight was solid, real, a weapon. Silas opened the door just enough to block the entrance with his body. Abernathy stood there, rain dripping from his hat, his face flushed with whiskey and malice. "We've come to collect my property," he slurred, trying to push past. Silas did not move. He was a wall of buckskin and muscle. "She is not your property." His voice was dangerously low. "I paid for her," Abernathy spat. $6. "Now step aside before we—" He never finished the threat. Alara stepped forward, emerging from the shadows behind Silas to stand in the firelight. She held the poker in a two-handed grip, its tip pointed toward Abernathy's chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drum of terror and exhilaration, but her hands were steady. Her face was set in a mask of grim determination. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was her statement. The drunken bravado drained from Abernathy's face, replaced by stunned disbelief, then a flicker of fear. He had come expecting a cowering victim and a lone, savage man. He found instead a united front, two silent figures framed in the doorway, unmovable as the mountain itself. He looked from Silas's cold, unwavering eyes to Alara's fierce, resolute glare, at the iron poker held between them. He saw not a prize to be taken, but a fight he could not win. With a muttered curse, Abernathy and his men stumbled back from the light of the doorway, melting into the stormy darkness. Silas watched them go, then slowly closed the door and slid the heavy bar back into place. The sound echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the cabin. He turned to her. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the aftermath of shared danger. He looked at the poker still gripped in her hands, then at her face. A change had occurred. He had brought a victim to his mountain, but the woman standing before him now was not a victim. She was a survivor, partner. He reached out and gently took the poker from her hands, his fingers brushing hers. It was a gesture of dismissal for the weapon, but one of acknowledgement for the woman who had wielded it. He returned it to its place by the hearth. Neither of them spoke of it again. They did not have to. The storm outside eventually broke, giving way to the clean, quiet world that follows a downpour. In the days that followed, a new equilibrium was found. The silence between them was no longer a void of the unknown, but a space of shared understanding. It was comfortable, companionable. He taught her, through action rather than words, how to read the tracks of deer, how to set a snare, how to find true north by the stars. She, in turn, brought a measure of softness to his Spartan existence, tending a small herb garden, baking bread that filled the cabin with a warm, comforting scent, her presence a quiet anchor in his solitary world. One clear, cold morning, Alara stood outside the cabin, looking out at the vast expanse of the valley below. The world stretched out before her, a tapestry of green and gold under a limitless blue sky. The air was crisp, and she breathed it in deeply. Felt like the first true breath of her life. The shame that had once defined her felt like a story about someone else, a lifetime ago. Her body was not a burden. It was the vessel of her strength, the reason she had endured. Her worth was not a number assigned by cruel men in a muddy town square. It was in the capable work of her hands, the resilience of her spirit, the quiet dignity she had reclaimed for herself. Silas came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. He held out a small object on his open palm. It was a bird, carved from a piece of pale pine, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The detail was exquisite, each feather rendered with a patient, loving hand. It was beautiful. It was a gift. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a little rough, unused to expressing such sentiment. He simply nodded, his gaze on the horizon. They stood there together for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, two solitary figures who had found an unlikely sanctuary. The future was an unwritten map, its paths uncertain. But standing there on the edge of the world, with the solid weight of the carved bird in her hand and the steady presence of the mountain man beside her, Alara Flint felt, for the first time, not a flicker of fear, but the vast, quiet, and soaring hope of a bird taking flight.